There are two sources of chromatographic nomenclature, two main sources. One is the IUPAC booklets, and I cited at least one of that reference on the first slide. Those are all available now on the internet. One problem is it's rather difficult to use them. They used to publish these things in books, and they had what was called an orange book. And the orange book came out, I think, at least 4 editions, and they started publishing these back in the 1930s. Not just for chromatography, they name everything. Everything in physical chemistry and electrochemistry and everything else, they decide on what people should do. I don't think many people read them. The books they were never very common. I happen to have 3 or 4 of the older orange books. It is easier, and then they occasionally publish it in the IUPAC, what do they call it, the Journal of Pure and Applied Chemistry. But there again, very few people read it, and so they do publish it. And another good thing about it is they do not retain copyright on these things, so anyone is free to quote it anywhere, and that's a good thing. But now it's all on the internet, and you can find it on the internet. And if you're looking for a particular thing and you know the internet address that they give it, you can find it, or you can go to their website and you can try to find it. But you have to know what to call it or something. It's not like reading the book where you can thumb through and find what you want, get general information. So that complicates matters. But most of you are probably familiar with the LCGC publication, which is a free publication, but which is a rather good one and is widely read by chromatographers. Most chromatographers, I think, get the LCGC magazine. Now, they published in 2001, they did earlier too, but they updated it in 2001 and published a list of chromatography symbols and definitions. And I think there are about 200 or more symbols and definitions in that list. I have a copy of that particular publication. And what I did here on these pages, I went through the publication and picked out those terms which are at all relevant to current chromatography, and then there are fewer than half of the terms are relevant. So there may be about 80 terms that I simply copied here. I just photocopied them onto these pages, and these are relevant to current. Now, these reflect the IUPAC names. They say that in the publication, and Etre is a famous chromatographer who was mostly responsible, I think, for making up, at least for publicizing, most of this information. And he's involved with that 1939 publication that was cited. But he's still with us, and he's still writing. Anyway, I listed these things on here that I think are relevant. Some you find are not, some are more relevant than others, but it cuts down the list. And they're listed alphabetically. And so I would just point out a few of them. And let's see, if I go to that page 4, down in the lower left corner there, on page 4, you have the distribution constant or coefficient, and the official symbol that is for my UPAC and the LCGC summary is K sub C for that. And they show there the way that you would write the equation. Retention time is equal to mobile phase volume plus K sub C times V sub S. Now the C implies that you have concentration in both phases. And Usually, in most chromatographic publications, they don't use the C. They just use the uppercase K. But if it's not in concentration, then, for instance, they give an example here. If the solid stationary phase, in the solid stationary phase, K sub G can be used, meaning that you have a weight concentration. But in countercurrent, in fact, it almost always is concentration in both phases. Yeah.
Just a question.
Yeah.
It's not a constant.
No, it's not. But that doesn't matter. That's why I think maybe it is better to call it a ratio, call it a distribution ratio rather than a constant. But they refer to it as a constant.
They refer to this as a constant. It's a ratio.
Right.
A constant.
It's really a ratio. It's constant in a particular system. If you don't change anything in the system, and especially they don't have too much opportunity. Although in, let's say, reverse phase system, reverse phase on C18 silica, if you're running a phase where you change the pH, this will not be constant. If you change the pH, that will change. But if you keep the pH the same, it's a constant. So they call it a constant in the sense that it is constant as for a particular chromatographic system. If you change that system at all, if you change the temperature, if you change particularly the pH or the solvent system, that will change. So, so for instance, in a gradient system, that changes. It continually changes. But they do call it a constant. There was really nothing wrong with the term partition coefficient that's been used, and I'm not sure that it doesn't still exist for people. Well, for people in physical chemistry, I think they still may use partition coefficient, and in partition chromatography with a stationary matrix, maybe they still use it too. But I don't know. For every so many years, some committee decides that everyone should call it something different, and that's what happens. But it's not always the best choice that could be made. So you do have to realize that is not a constant. It's what I would call the apparent partition coefficient, or the apparent distribution constant. It varies with certain variables. But it's constant within certain terms. But nevertheless, that's the nomenclature that they use. But a ratio, okay, then if it's a concentration ratio, that's not saying that it's constant. Either one, I think, would be acceptable. Maybe ratio is a better term, or coefficient, either of those. But they want to use distribution instead of partition. Now, the important thing there is that the K sub C is always the ratio of concentration in stationary phase over mobile. That's always true. Stationary phase over mobile. So if you switch phases, then your constant would become the reciprocal of the other. And the ratio is determined as the total amount, whatever form it's in, whether it's a dimer, an ion, an intact species, the sum of all those in one phase divided by the sum of all those in the other phase. So that's the way it's defined. And they never do use D, uppercase D, because that conflicts with another term, and that's the diffusion coefficient. For the diffusion coefficient, they do use D, and so they don't want those terms to conflict. Okay. The 11. Yeah, here 11. We have there. Now they do say partition coefficient K, and then they. I get it on my. Yeah. Partition coefficient K the ratio of equilibrium concentration of solute stationary relative to mobile phase, also called the distribution coefficient, and there they do have the symbol K sub D. But I made the note that that is not commonly used. The distribution constant, K sub C, that's the official symbol for it. But the K sub D is not so bad. The uppercase D presents a problem. Let's see here. Yeah, okay, on the upper left there, the phase ratio, beta. They use beta to mean the phase volume ratio, again, stationary over mobile, stationary phase volume over mobile, they call beta. So we need to make a little distinction there because we have two betas. The beta, one of the betas is the ratio of the distance from the planet axis to the particular distance, particular coil that you're talking about, distance from the center of the axis, divided by the orbital radius. And so that came from the beginning of Ito's work. So it's convenient for us to call that beta sub r for the radius ratio, and then we need beta sub v for the volume ratio. So it's not a big deal. That's a bit of a conflict even within our own field. Okay. And then on page 13, what do we have there? Yeah, they use a KD again there in the retention volume. Yeah, on the lower right in the retention volume, they write the same equation that was given before, but there they're using a KD. So, but as I say, KD is not commonly used. Usually the plain K is used. And but that doesn't present too much of a conflict anyway. But there is some conflict even within the chromatographic community as to what these symbols, and between them and IUPAC. Problem with IUPAC is they're a very, very bureaucratic organization. They take forever to get things going through. They go through a committee, and then another committee approves it, and then eventually they say it's official. But that could take 10 years. It's not a rapid process. You can see this if you look through their older literature. And they have committees for different groups, like there's another committee for physical chemistry. And they have another committee for extraction, a completely separate group. They don't seem to pay attention to one another. So there doesn't seem to be enough effort to keep symbols consistent across the whole range of chemistry. There isn't any need to have these conflicts. There's no reason they can't all use the same symbols. I mean, I taught undergraduate students and graduate students for 33 years, and these kinds of conflicts are confusing to a student. It makes the equations look different when they're identical. And so, I mean, if you have two different definitions in making up an equation, you'll think it's a completely different equation, and it's the same thing. So, okay, that's really about all I wanted to say about this. At the end, I made a note on the bottom indicating I didn't write that those definitions or anything. That's just a summary of what exists, and you can get you can get this, it's updated more or less continuously on the website for the LCGC. I gave that symbol, that address on the first page there. So you can look it up and see what it is. It's easier to find in the printed publication rather than the website. But, I gave you the shorter list here, so you can consult it if you're concerned about what nomenclature to use. And as Alan has pointed out, we do have a committee that is discussing these things, and nothing is final at this point. You can see that even within our committee there's discussion about what's the right way to say these things.
I would like to add one word.
Yeah.
Walter, you did the best slide I've ever seen in here.
Oh,
You're
yes.
skipping
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
This slide is wonderful. Look at the LC columns. You see retention time, volume, retention factor, conversion on the left, liquid chromatography. Look on the right, that's CCC. What's the difference?
Yeah.
No stationary phase volume on the left. Never,
Right.
never. They don't care about the stationary phase, and it's critical for us, and we see it clearly there. On the left, you have MMM, which is mobile phase. Where's the stationary phase? We don't care, it's a constant, and they even don't know the volume of the stationary phase. And we do. We have VS, VS, VS everywhere on the right column. So this slide shows very well the big difference we have. It shows also that what you want to show, that it's the same family. So we have agreement, and we must work with them, and we are not competitors at all, but we should accept each other.
Yeah, I think we have to accept what is common practice and not start arguments over it, and not make ourselves sound as a different community. You can see these equations for LC. Usually they're presented in values of time. These are in values of volume, but they are identical equations. These equations are identical, even the ones that are here in terms of capacity ratio, or now they call it retention factor. Even these two equations, they are equivalent. If you use the right equivalency down here, you can convert one to the other. The other thing about it is, with the countercurrent chromatography, you can look at this and you can see already, just by looking at the chromogram, what the partition coefficients are before you do any calculations. Can't do that with liquid chromatography. It comes down to the fact you don't know the stationary phase, and so the chromatogram looks different. And when I was teaching chromatography to undergraduates, I found we went through, I taught in School of Pharmacy, so we taught a lot of ionic equilibrium first. That came ionic equilibrium and extraction chromatography. But once you go to countercurrent chromatography, now it's very easy to go backwards into solid phase chromatography. Then and you can see then what the difference is. Here we're really getting a plot of partition coefficients, or of stationary phase volumes, whereas this is a kind of arbitrary factor. This is the quantity in both phases, whereas this is the concentration in both phases. And while they're related, this one is visibly apparent, whereas that one is not. You end up getting repetition of the mobile phase volume. So it's much easier to teach countercurrent chromatography first, but you have to get a countercurrent chromatograph into all the chemistry departments, you see, in order for that to ever happen. And very few have one. Okay.